My name is Eric Holcomb, and I am the Executive Director of the Baltimore City Commission for Historical and Architectural Preservation. I'm also the Division Chief for the Historic and Architectural Preservation Division for the Department of Planning.
Okay, thank you. So our first question is how Fells Point became a National Historic District, which is different than a CHAP designated district, I guess. So are you familiar with what went on years ago with Fells Point?
Yes, from a historian's perspective, I wasn't involved myself, but I've met a lot of the people that were involved. It was listed on the National Register in 1969. I think it was the second or third National Register Historic District in the country. It was one of the first ones, at least the first five. And it was listed at incredible speeds to help with the road fight. And the road fight, of course, refers to the construction of a limited access highway through downtown Baltimore. It would have clipped Federal Hill. It would have been bridged over the Inner Harbor and landed in Fells Point and sort of demolished most of the 18th century architecture in Fells Point. So the National Register was a tool at that time to help prevent the demolition and destruction, actually, of Fells Point.
And it worked?
It was part of a long process that eventually worked, yes. 1966 was the National Historic Preservation Act. It was an act from Congress, and that created what we call now the Section 106 program. Section 106 refers to the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and that act states that whenever federal projects, federally funded projects or federally permitted projects, they all need to go through a review to see if there are going to be any deleterious effects on historic resources. So that's one of the things the National Register designation did, was say, hey, this is a really historic district here, and your project, which is the highway project, is going to have huge ramifications and destroy the neighborhood. Therefore, you need to look for alternatives.
And so you talked about a little bit of the protections, but there was apparently a feeling that Fells Point needed more protections as time went on. So what was lacking in the original historic district designation that were maybe extra protections that the area needed?
Fells Point became a National Register Historic District in 1969, but the National Register Historic District is a federal historic district. It is a historic district codified at the federal level. It starts at the Maryland Historical Trust and it ends with the Secretary of Interior signing the nomination form, creating the district. There are no land use protections in a National Register Historic District. So basically, if you are in a National Register Historic District and you want to demolish your house, you can do that. If you wanted to take off the front facade and put on a vinyl siding front facade on your federal, in your National Register District row house, you would be able to, as long as it met the Baltimore City Building Code. It is the local historic districts that have the land use protections. And that basically means all exterior changes in a local historic district would be reviewed and approved by CHAP. And that would be by CHAP staff, and then we would apply our National Register, our historic district design guidelines.
Okay, so you mentioned CHAP. Can you tell me what it is and why it was created?
Yeah. CHAP stands for the Commission for Historical and Architectural Preservation. We were created in 1964. That was 2 years before the National Historic Preservation Act, so we beat the feds by 2 years on preservation. And it was created to administer the design review of the Mount Vernon Place Local Historic District, which was created in 1964. That was in 64. Then in 65, the mayor was Theodore McKeldin at the time, and he drove by the Broadway Market, and they saw the city crews tearing off the second story of that market. And he was so upset that he ran over and added to our city ordinance. Article 6 of the Baltimore City Code is the law that governs CHAP. That CHAP has design review and an advisory role on all changes to city-owned buildings. So that is how that was created. Then back in 1967, we got the authority to do Baltimore City landmarks, and then we started with one local historic district, and now we have 34, soon to be 35 local historic districts, about 14, soon to be 14,000 properties under design review.
Oh, I didn't realize that the markets were like instrumental in this whole process to begin with.
And part of it, yes. Yeah.
Okay, going back just a step, can you give us an overview of Baltimore City's involvement with real estate developments? How are they regulated? CHAP
Sure.
is a historic portion of it, but I guess the city has a lot more comprehensive authority than just CHAP, right?
Yeah, you know, the city has a design and building code, and they have different regulations. And basically, the regulations are there to protect the public and to protect the public good. So we have you know, an urban renewal plan that was put in place many years ago and stood there until 2007. And that's when the local designation came to be. So you have an urban renewal plan that has some overlay regulations in it. You have zoning, you know, and zoning sort of talks to the uses of buildings as well as sort of the height, massing, scale, setbacks of buildings, how they sit on the street, how they relate to the street. Now we have even floodplain regulations, which will influence Fells Point. And that's to make sure that we are reviewing and approving plans that will make a building more resilient to the imminent flooding that will be occurring in the next several decades. And of course, we follow the International Building Code, and that's sort of your building to make sure that, you know, the brick wall that you're putting up or you're repairing is going to stay up. Now, CHAP falls into that, is that we review all exterior changes to make sure that those changes respect and preserve as much as possible the historic character and the historic fabric of a community.
Okay. And we talked about the National Historic District protections and how they compare to CHAP. Did you have anything more to say about that? I think we've covered a lot of it.
Yeah, not really. Just the fact is that the protections of historic preservation lie at the local level. The local level governs local land use, and that's why you see the historic preservation commissions throughout the country having that authority. We're very fortunate that our building code is very strong and allows CHAP staff and CHAP to review and have good protections for local historic districts.
So talk about how Fells Point became a CHAP district, because that was a long time after it was a National Register district, even though I think it's obvious we could have used those protections before, but tell us how that happened.
Well, yeah, there was several things that were going on. Fells Point did have urban renewal plan protections on it, and one of the things that the urban renewal plan did for Fells Point and Federal Hill was to create a design review that also incorporated the Preservation Society, the Society for the Preservation of Fells Point and Federal Hill. So they worked with the planners that were administering the urban renewal plan to do design review. And there were guidelines in that urban renewal plan that were preservation friendly, that were meant to help protect the historic fabric. It was about 2007, Councilman Kraft at the time. He would actually be a wonderful person to interview too, because he would be directly involved with this. He really looked at a process to create a local historic district, to change to create a zoning overlay, put in place a local historic district, and then they would repeal the urban renewal plan and basically replace it with change zoning and the local historic district. So that's how we came to play, and that eventually came to fruition in 2007. I bet we started in 2004. Lots of public meetings on that. But by 2007, that's when the local designation came into place, and you started seeing the repealing of the urban renewal plan.
Okay. And can you talk about CHAP and the Broadway markets? You mentioned one case where it actually influenced the startup of CHAP, but what else about the Broadway markets and CHAP can you tell us?
Well, I don't think that we have really weighed in recently, or even the 10 years that we've been a district, on major changes to the Broadway markets. Any of the exterior changes would be reviewed and approved by our office, and when it comes to the point, plans come to fruition, they will be submitted and reviewed at a public hearing at CHAP. And we're excited to work with folks here. I think everybody has the same goal of really creating a vibrant, dynamic market of some kind there to really attract and serve the community.
So before we started the interview, we were talking, and you were mentioning to me that you didn't consider the markets especially historic. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, sure. We look at historic preservation design review from some very narrow lenses, so to speak. So we're looking at the changes to the physical fabric. And in terms of the physical fabric, the South Pavilion is relatively new, and I don't know if we would be considered historic, so we could see significant changes there. And the North Market, as we said before, the second story was taken off, and a lot of the changes occurred. The creation of the front on the north, and sort of the bricking in of some of those arched openings. So a lot of changes have occurred. So, historic preservationists would ask the question, does the market still retain its historic integrity? And I think that's a question that we would need to do research on and come to a determination. And I think that determination would be, we would work with the community, and we would ask the community what they think and their advice, and then that may be a decision at a public hearing, at a CHAP public hearing. So that's what we're talking about. Nevertheless, in terms of a market has been there since, I think, 1786 when it was first there. The market system should be, the Broadway market should be celebrated as integral to that part of the history, even though the shell of that history has been changed drastically. So. I would love to see some sort of interpretation of it, some sort of celebration of that market.
I guess I'm a little bit surprised that the South Market's not historic, because I had this idea that the markets looked like that for a long, long time. I mean, I know when they first started, they didn't have the outside walls and stuff, but I just thought that was a design that had been there for a long time.
Yeah, and that's something that we would have to do a research on, but I think my first swipe at it, that it was relatively new. It was probably a post-World War II where a lot of the changes occurred to that market. But that's something that, I think there's always been a market shed there, and I think there was actually another one just directly south of there. I think there were three market sheds.
3 or 4.
3 or 4,
what people have told me, yeah. Okay.
So.
Okay, then I think we've covered that section. Can you talk about any recent noteworthy demolitions in the Fells Point Historic District and why they would have been allowed?
Yeah, and right before I came in here, I asked Eddie Leon, who's the staff planner for this area, and also worked a little bit on the, I think he was actually the lead on the designation of Fells Point in 2007. And CHAP was never approved of any demolitions after 2007 of significant of any buildings, really. We've approved of rare additions and maybe garage buildings, but the demolitions of St. Stanislaus, in the St. Stanislaus area, or the demolition that occurred around the North Broadway Market area, that was all approved prior to the local historic designation.
So that's one of the reasons why the community wanted it so badly.
That's right. So that may have been one of the reasons that really kicked it off. You see a lot of historic district designations occur after the building of or the demolition of historic buildings in neighborhoods, and then the neighborhood association says, oh, we don't want this to happen again.
And when I was looking through some of my old records and footage about the Marketplace at Fells Point project that surrounds the Broadway Markets, there were really two series of demolitions, and the first was right before CHAP because they would have never been able to demolish those buildings under CHAP. But then there was a second set of demolitions when they first started building, where they demolished the first set of demolitions were where they demolished the buildings they thought could not be salvaged and the back parts of the buildings that were not historic at all. And then the second phase, they demolished everything but the absolute storefronts.
Right.
And that occurred when CHAP was in place. And I didn't have a really good documentation about it, except there were some comments that made it sound like the buildings couldn't have been salvaged, but I don't. Do you have any history on that yourself?
Yeah. One of the things I was remiss to talk about, as you know, one of the government regulations, there's this thing called a PUD, which stands for Plan Unit Development, and they're basically sort of a regulation tool to help sort of comprehensive projects in neighborhoods that need sort of zoning changes or other types of changes to make a project work. And in 2007, if you look at the ordinance for the designation of Fells Point, it will talk about the planned unit development and how CHAP, how the approvals in that PUD is something that CHAP will honor, and some of those were the demolitions. So that's how it was. So that's how we were ensured that the developer at the time wasn't going to be doing all this work and spending thousands of dollars and going through a city approval process, and then the city changes that process on them. So that was one of the reasons why those were occurred. That's why CHAP did not approve of those demolitions, but they were already, through the ordinance, they were honored.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I just know that at least some people in the community were surprised when everything got demolished behind the facades and didn't understand that was part of the approved process or part of the PUD process at all.
Yeah, that's, you know, we want to work, you know, closely with developers and community associations. And I think one of the things as a city employee is really to try to reduce the surprises on everybody's part, even though there's always surprises there. But that's something I think is very important, at least to the CHAP staff, is to. And I wish that we could have reduced the surprise to the community, because yeah, it did surprise the community.
Okay. So this is my own personal question. It really isn't quite so related to this, but do you know how the decision to demolish the rest of the buildings happened? Because it didn't seem like it was very visibly part of the community information process.
That's something we could look into, because the planned unit development would have had to have been approved at Planning Commission and City Council.
Okay.
So there would have been, and those two would have had at least two public, well, one public hearing at Planning Commission, probably more than that, because PUDs usually take 2 or 3 hearings. And then at City Council, there would have been the committee hearing, which would have been the big one, and then of course the City Council hearings, first reader, second reader, and third reader. I don't know how that may be a question for Councilman or former Councilman Kraft.
Okay. Yeah, I think if we end up going down that route, maybe he would be a good person to talk to. I mean, I'm not surprised to hear that they couldn't save a lot of the buildings, because Dan Winter actually took me on a walkthrough and we filmed a lot of the buildings, and you know, some of them were in really bad shape. I'm just, it just felt to the community, at least some of us, that it was, you know, like a sleight of hand almost. But okay, how can communities influence building and preservation issues? And you know, we're really thinking primarily about the markets right now, but just in general, how can communities influence some of this?
Well, I think there are many ways. I think, you know, I think the best way the several important things to do is to make sure that there is an open and communication and dialogue with the city officials and also your city councilmen. And I think that would be the first thing, to make sure that those dialogues are two-way and there is a sharing of information. I know that the planners here at the planning department work extremely hard to make sure that the community associations are aware of decisions along the way, and really try to reach out and get the insights and support and testimony from the community. So with that in mind, you know, we meaning the planning department, work through sort of the neighborhood associations and organizations down there. So as a citizen, that would be one thing, is just to make sure that you're looking at things and making sure that you're being aware of what's going on and what are the next steps to this. And to really start to influence the design or influencing the uses, any type of consensus building, and having a singular voice. I know you can't have a singular voice in a community.
Fells Point has a bad reputation of having a singular voice anyway.
But the more that there is talk and you know, consensus building and trying to get at least behind some very basic vision statements, and then really start to drill down into you know, more of what you're looking for. You know, what does the community want there? Does the community want the market to be, to serve the community, to be a place for the community to get the fresh groceries? Are they looking for more restaurants? Is this going to be a market for both the tourists and the community? So I think there's a lot of those types of questions. How do you guys see that building wanting to be used? Of course, there's also the economics that come into play. But all those, you know, I think all need to be, you know, again, will be worked out, I think, in an open dialogue. So that's the first thing, you know, just to make sure that dialogue is a two-way street, and you guys are telling city officials and telling, you know, coming to testimony and asking the developers to come to community association meetings, and really, you know, asking them to work with you. So that's the other thing too, is, you know, if a developer can, you know, get buy-in from the community, that's a huge win for the developer, because also the developer and the community are coming arm in arm to garner support from the city officials. So that's really important too, is that not only talking to the city planners and HCD officials, but also, and maybe transportation, but also your city councilman, the mayor's office, and open up the dialogue with the developers and the markets, municipal association.
Yeah, I think in the case of the Broadway Markets, there isn't a developer that wants to touch the thing right now. So I don't know if that would help at all. And I don't know if you have any other more specific comments about the Broadway Markets and what the community could do, other than just the kind of generic ones you just gave me.
If there's no developer, then you know, I would again really just reach out to the mayor's office, the city councilmen, city officials, and let them know what your vision is. So when the municipal association puts out their RFP, they'll have the wishes of the community.
Okay. Okay, so, and then the last question you didn't feel like you could answer. So this is the final question. What is your personal vision, if you have one, for what should happen with the Broadway Markets? And we're asking this as everybody, so you're not the definitive authority or anything. It's just from what you've seen.
Well, I think, you know, the Broadway Markets, you know, I think there's a wonderful opportunity to serve the community, to sort of attract the economics of sort of a tourism, hopefully pedestrian-based sort of cultural tourism, because those tourists seem to be gentler and kinder to the fabric and the communities. So I think there's that wonderful. I'd love to see history be part of the markets, whether it is a history that is shown in the redesign or history celebrated through some sort of interpretive panels. But I think that, to say, hey, that this is another iteration of a wonderful history that goes back to the 18th century, it would be great. And I think that there's a way to, to sort of create sort of unity of the streetscape. Like you said, I think there were 3, as you said, maybe even 4 market sheds there. Maybe 4 market sheds are too much there now, but to bring back a presence, I think would be wonderful. But I think at the end of the day, it should always be a design and a reuse plan that serves the community, that's economically viable, that's attractive, and I think using history is important to do that.
Thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to say that I haven't asked you?
I think now it's a wide open question, and
well, and you can't leave until you answer it.
That's right. Well, I just would just like to say that Fells Point is I think one of the most remarkable neighborhoods, not only in this city and not only in the state, but I think in the country. I think the history and the heritage and the culture of Fells Point is extremely important to the national story and our national identity, as it is with local identity. So I really think it's really important that all of us work together from an understanding of that importance. And I think by doing that, we can really, use our history to create one of the most dynamic places. I think it's already very dynamic, but to really make it shine, not only for the residents, but for the shop owners and for the tourists, and I think for all of the citizens of Baltimore. With that, just stepping back and just looking at Frederick Douglass, one of the most important 19th century Americans in the United States. He's extremely important. Billie Holiday changed jazz, and she was part of the sort of the history that was going on there. We have what's now the Calkers houses, which are also known as the Wooden houses or the Wolf Street houses or the Two Sisters houses. As you can see by the many iterations of the names, how deep the history is. But we're finding out that those are not only some of the rarest buildings in Baltimore and on the East Coast of America, but also on the Atlantic Rim of going into England and Europe. Those were the types of houses that were being built during the industrialization of European and American cities. So the importance of those houses, importance to that story is really important. So, and of course the shipbuilding. You can't forget, the ships coming out and and Fells Point's role in the War of 1812, all extremely important. Bottom line is, I think the history there, the way that to preserve that history and to use that history to create a 21st century neighborhood is what I'm here to do, what I hope to do.
Well, you sound like you're ideally cut out for your job. It sounds like you love the history of it.
Sure do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh boy.
I actually live in a house that was one of the ones that the city bought, as they were planning on demolishing it for the road fight.
Right.
And my next door neighbor told us that the roof had caved in and everything, and of course they weren't maintaining those buildings.
Yeah.
So it was a total rehab by the time somebody bought it.
Right. And that's a national story too, the road fight. That has, you know. In fact, did you see the New York Times article
Turn
on?
the camera's back on. He's still talking.
I got it.
Well, there was that New York Times article on on how cities are trying to get rid of their highways, you know, and really talking about how the highways destroyed Buffalo, and look what happened to Philadelphia. And now in Fells Point, though, you know, we saved it. And so I think that we have a really huge opportunity to showcase urbanism in America.
Well, Fells Point is still wringing its hands over parking, though.
Right.
If we had less cars, the parking wouldn't be so much of a problem.
Well, it was funny. In 2004, the staff to CHAP moved into the planning department, and you know, it was the first time that we were really working on a daily basis with the planning department. And you know, we didn't know what we were doing. So it was the deputy director at the time. I was sitting there. We were sitting in the meeting and talking, and I asked a couple questions, and then the meeting was out. So, and then afterwards, I walked up to him and sort of said, "Hey, you know, I don't know if I said anything. You know, if I asked an intelligent question." He goes, "Oh yeah, you were fine. And just remember, if you really want to look intelligent, always ask about the parking." And when you think about it, though, you know, the integration of the automobile in urban areas is probably one of the single most planning issues of the 20th century. How do you get the parking from A to Z? Robert Moses, why is he famous? Because he was getting cars from A to B, and he wanted to sort of bypass the city by just plowing through the city. Yeah, I mean, you had Robert Moses come into Baltimore in 1945 to create our highway plan.
Well, thank you.
Are you from here, from Baltimore? Were you born here?
No, I was actually born in Idaho, but I've and well, I moved when I was 8 years old. We moved to Gaithersburg in Montgomery County, and then I've been in Baltimore since 1980. I mean, yeah, since 1989. Jeez.
I was born in Iowa.
Oh, were you?
Another
Another I-state, right. So, but I just, you know, I kind of fell in love with Baltimore, and I just remember, like, you know, after the first or second year working for CHAP, it was like, you know, I was actually walking with Dean Krimmel, and he's a local historian and does a lot of good. Oh, good. Oh, good.
He was telling us the history of the Baltimore markets.
Oh,
Broadway Markets.
Good. Yeah, so he knows them, right? He
Yeah,
knows
he
the
does.
history. But we were walking down the street, you know, and we were talking about Shari Olson, who wrote that wonderful book on Baltimore, The Building of a Great American City, and it's sort of like the best history on the development of Baltimore. And I said, "Wow, whatever happened to her?" And he's like, "Oh, she went off to Canada." And I'm like, "She did all this work in Baltimore, and then she just went off and did another project in Canada?" And he goes, "Yeah." And I said, "I think I'm just going to stay in Baltimore and just learn more and more about it, and just really try to, go deep instead of broad."
I was working at Procter & Gamble in Cincinnati, and they transferred me out here, and I just never wanted to go back.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, there's something. Baltimore's quirky, and there is it has everything to it. I think. I was down at Fells Point at Berthas yesterday. They have the Sunday afternoon showcases music, and they had the what they call the Telecasters, and it's like 3 guitar masters on their Telecasters having a ball. And it was just great. And it's great. You kind of sit there, and the front door's open, so you see everybody walk by, and then they take 3 steps back and look in, and then you see people walking, and you see, like, sometimes the little kids run by and they look in to see what's going on, and these guys playing the guitar and music coming out. It's just wonderful.
Yeah, I'm really glad they got the square open again.
Yeah.
It just seemed like it tore the heart of the city out, or the community out, when that square was fenced off for so long. Communal space is so important, and the use of it is so important, and it's almost like you always just got to work at it. You got to work at programming it, and I wouldn't say redesigning it every few years, but always just making sure it serves the purposes of the community. And you're right, it's so important, and it changes the whole feel. Yeah, I never really thought about that kind of stuff until, like, I got to know Dave Holmes and Dan Winter and just different developers. and they think about the world entirely different than the rest of us,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in terms of the interaction of public and private space and how arrangements of things change interactions. It's a really different way of thinking about things.
Yeah, yeah, it is, and you know, that's exciting for me too. The just learning, you know, learning the planning history, learning how the physical development sort of represents and sort of affects the way, you know, culture and our beliefs and biases, and so that's always a lot of fun.
But as a resident of Fells Point, I want to thank you for being one of the ones that is kind of a safeguard to our history and our historic areas.
Well, thank you, and you know, we're trying. You know,
I know that people get mad at you sometimes, and sometimes
Right.
it's probably a thankless job, but
Right.
I think it's really worthwhile.
Well, we're you know, we're always trying to make it work, and usually we find you know, design solutions that, you know, preserve and respects the historic fabric, and people can move on and with their uses or what they want to do to the buildings, and so we work hard to have that happen.